Hello students, and welcome to the lecture on bilateral and multilateral trade laws. After this lecture, we will be able to learn the following objectives. Describe the general agreement on trade and tariffs. Explain the World Trade Organization. Brief about dispute settlement mechanism under WTO. Explain the problems of patent laws. Define the Global Convention on Competitiveness. Let's start with the introduction of bilateral and multilateral trade laws. A trade agreement is a contract, agreement, or pact between two or more nations that outlines how they will work together to ensure mutual benefit in the field of trade and investment. Such trade agreements may involve cooperation in the field of R&D, the lowering of import duties to be levied on the other partner's exports, guaranteeing any investments made by the partners in the home market, cooperation on the tax front, etc. Bilateral and multilateral agreements. Trade agreements are usually bilateral or multilateral. A bilateral trade agreement, as the name suggests, is an agreement between two nations, while a multilateral trade agreement involves more than two nations. Let's now discuss the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. The General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or GATT, was originally created by the Bretton Woods Conference as part of a larger plan for economic recovery after World War II. The GATT's main purpose was to reduce barriers to global trade. This was achieved through the reduction of tariff barriers, quantitative restrictions, and subsidies on trade through a series of different agreements.
Now, I don't want to give anyone the false impression that tariffs are out of control. In fact, on average, tariffs on traded goods are lower than they were at any point in the 20th century. Let me give you a little background first. In the 1920s, when Herbert Hoover was running for office, he made a campaign promise to U.S. farmers to protect them from foreign competition if he was elected to office. Once he was elected, he needed legislative support to get a bill moving through Congress. Getting started wasn't so bad. Legislators from farming states are more than happy to sponsor such a bill. But that wasn't enough votes to actually get it passed. So what do you do if you're seeking support for a farming protection bill from people who care nothing about farming? What if, for example, you're approaching a representative from Detroit? How do you make the proposed bill more interesting? Add a line or two about protecting automakers, perhaps? And so it went. A little something for car makers, furniture producers, textile manufacturers. In the end, the Smoot-Hawley bill entailed protection for over 20,000 U.S. products. Now, other countries in the world weren't sitting idly by as Smoot-Hawley was making its rounds. They were, to say the least, rather unhappy at the prospect of restrictions on so many of their own products. In an attempt to stop the U.S., other countries threatened to impose restrictions of their own if Smoot-Hawley passed. Some countries, like Canada, wrote up their own protectionist legislation, while others simply said that they would boycott U.S. products. Nonetheless, in 1929, the Smoot-Hawley bill became law, the first shot in a global trade war. Between 1929 and 1932, the total volume of world trade fell from a total value of about $3 billion to only $1 billion, making Smoot-Hawley one of the major contributing factors to the Great Depression. Europe was soon embroiled in World War II, with the U.S. to follow. After the war, countries around the world agreed that perhaps the trade brawl had been a mistake that ought not to be repeated, and many of them sat down and formed an agreement to begin scaling back the tariff restrictions. This was the birth of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. At their highest, around 1930, the average level of tariffs on traded goods was at about 70%, nearly doubling the prices on imported goods. With the first full round of GATT in 1947, tariffs were reduced to about 40%, and then reduced further with each subsequent round. By 1993, GATT was in its ninth round, the Uruguay round, and tariffs were down to about 2 to 3% average on traded goods. Here's the thing, though. Just because governments have agreed to cut tariffs, does this mean that the weak domestic industries stop wanting protection? No. So if you sign an agreement that says your country won't use tariffs, does this necessarily mean that no protection will be used? No. In fact, with the decline in tariffs came an increase in quotas. So then GATT began to address quotas. With the decline in quotas came an increase in the use of voluntary export restraints, VERs, or other non-tariff barriers, NTBs, like health and safety restrictions. Take a look at the duration of each round. Do you notice that each round gets longer and longer? That's because 1. It gets harder and harder to trim the fat. 2. The most contentious products, usually agriculture, kept getting put on the back burner. And 3. The Uruguay round was the first to try to deal with the trade restrictions placed on services. Back when GATT started, it was dealing only with hard goods like cars and refrigerators. Trade in financial services, technical consulting, and the like didn't appear until later. It took the better part of 9 years to complete the Uruguay round, and when it was done, not only were there reductions in protection, but also the old GATT was gone. It evolved into the World Trade Organization, or WTO. The WTO is meant to serve as a place for trade dispute mediation. If one country has a complaint about another country's trade policies, that complaint can be heard by the WTO. Here's an interesting tidbit from The Economist magazine. As of 2009, the U.S. was the single most challenged country, i.e., the country that has had the most complaints lodged against it for unfair trade policies. However, we are also the single largest complaining nation. The U.S. has lodged more complaints against other countries than any other single nation. Keep these facts in mind for a WTO discussion that we'll be having in our next face-to-face class.
The role of GATT in integrating developing countries into an open multilateral trading system is also of major consequence. The increasing participation of developing countries in the GATT trading system and the pragmatic support provided to them through the flexible application of certain rules help developing countries to both expand and diversify their trade. It could now be said that a great number of these countries have already become full partners in the system, as can be witnessed by their active participation in the Uruguay round. The challenges that we face are therefore enormous. The only way back from this globalization in the world economy would be through depression and eventual chaos. We therefore have no choice but to move forward. In doing so, however, we must be sure to preserve to the highest extent possible the spirit and tradition of the GATT, which to a large extent was the key to its success. Now we will study the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization, or WTO, is a global organization that establishes rules for global trade through consensus among its member states. It also resolves disputes between the members, which are all signatories to its set of trade agreements. The WTO states that its aims are to increase global trade by promoting lower trade barriers and providing a platform for the negotiation of trade and to their business. Principles of the trading system. The WTO discussions should follow these fundamental principles of trading. A trading system should be free of discrimination in the sense that one country cannot privilege a particular trading partner above others within the system, nor can it discriminate against foreign products and services. A trading system should tend toward more freedom, that is, toward fewer trade barriers, tariffs and non-tariff barriers. A trading system should be predictable, with foreign companies and governments reassured that trade barriers will not be raised arbitrarily and that markets will remain open. A trading system should tend toward greater competition. Subjects of WTO: agriculture, services, non-agriculture, intellectual property rights. Role of WTO in globalization. WTO plays an important role in the principle of trade without discrimination in the free market trade. Most favored nation, or MFN. Treating other people equally. Under the WTO agreements, countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. Grant someone a special favor, such as a lower customs duty rate for one of their products, and we have to do the same for all other WTO members. National treatment. treating foreigners and locals equally. Imported and locally produced goods should be treated equally, at least after the foreign goods have entered the market. Freer trade, gradually through negotiation. Lowering trade barriers is one of the most obvious means of encouraging trade. The barriers concerned include customs duties or tariffs, and measures such as import bans or quotas that restrict quantities selectively. Predictability, through binding and transparency. With stability and predictability, investment is encouraged, jobs are created, and consumers can fully enjoy the benefits of competition choice and lower prices. The multilateral trading system is an attempt by governments to make the business environment stable and predictable.
Half the world's population live in poverty. These 2.8 billion people worldwide, who are living on less than $2 a day, could work themselves out of poverty if trade was fair. However, trade is unfair. Take the country of Kenya, for example. In the 1970s, Kenya's future looked bright, with a growing economy and an industry starting to thrive. However, in the 1980s, for the return of aid from rich countries, strict liberalisation was enforced. The government had to reduce support for its farmers, cut tariffs, and deregulate markets. And yet when Kenya wanted entry into the WTO in the 1990s, further liberalisation was expected. Cheap, often subsidised goods from richer countries flooded the markets, from shoes and sugar to steel. The result has been fatal for Kenya's young industries, and their vulnerable farmers didn't stand a chance in competition with rich, powerful companies and countries. Moving to the 21st century, Kenya now faces the future with devastated industries, mass unemployment, and a generation without education. More Kenyans live in poverty now than they did in the 1970s. Fewer children go to school, fewer children are vaccinated, and more children die. Around the world, many artisans and producers of products such as cotton, cocoa, coffee, tea and handcrafts are marginalised due to the regulations put in place by large Western governments. This happens because more than 99% of world trade is conducted by the West, through rich governments and large companies and corporations, including the World Trading Organization and the World Banking Organization. They control the way trade is conducted through agreements and rules that they have created to protect their own interests. Not only do these imposed trade regulations allow cheap products to be dumped on poor countries' fledgling markets, they charge high taxes on imported goods so poor countries can only afford to export raw materials like cocoa and cotton. It is the rich who turn these into more valuable products and reap the rewards. Kenya is not alone. Poor countries only account for 0.4% of global trade. This makes them powerless to fight back. Trade rules need to change. The rules need to allow the 2.8 billion people living on less than $2 a day the chance to work themselves out of poverty.
Let's now understand the WTO Dispute Settlement Understanding. The WTO's procedure for resolving trade quarrels under the Dispute Settlement Understanding is vital for enforcing the rules and therefore for ensuring the trade flows smoothly. A dispute arises when a member government believes another member government is violating an agreement or a commitment that it has made in the WTO. The people behind these agreements are the member governments themselves. The agreements are the outcome of negotiations among members. Ultimate responsibility for settling disputes also lies with member governments through the dispute settlement body. First, the complaining party requests formal consultations with the other WTO member country or countries involved in the dispute. All such requests for formal consultations must be notified to the WTO's Dispute Settlement Body, or DSB, which consists of representatives from all WTO member countries and administers the rules and procedures governing the dispute settlement process. The consultation period can last up to 60 days. If the consultations fail to resolve the problem, the complaining party can then request that the DSB establish a panel of experts to adjudicate the merits of the case. Panelists are normally selected in consultation with the parties to the dispute. If the parties cannot agree on panelists, the WTO will appoint them. The panel selection process can take up to 45 days. The GATT dispute settlement system evolved as an increasingly rule-oriented judicial system for resolving global trade disputes. Its effectiveness, however, was greatly constrained by several weaknesses, in addition to the veto that led to increasing frustration among GATT member countries with respect to its application. The dispute settlement system survived, however, because of the long-term commitment of its members to maintaining the GATT framework. The principal shortcomings of the GATT dispute settlement system are: it did not specify clear objectives and procedures, such that settlements relied upon the creation of ad hoc processes. Ambiguity concerning the role of consensus, leading to the blocking of adverse decisions. The most comprehensive empirical analysis of the performance of the GATT settlement system is the review undertaken of all GATT disputes between 1948 and 1989. This study found that in spite of the shortcomings of the GATT dispute settlement procedures identified, the system resolved 88% of valid complaints submitted, measured by full or partial compliance. Amid concerns about the GATT system's increasing ineffectiveness after 1980, compliance was still 81%. Even though this period covers more than half of the total number of GATT complaints made. The structure of patent law in various countries has been the subject of discipline-specific debate. Although new issues arise and some changes are made to the law, many of the arguments remain both unchanged and unresolved. In the United States, for example, proposals to change from a first to invent, or FTI priority claim basis, to a first to file, or FTF basis, seem to reappear every 15 to 20 years. The writing contains many opinions on the expected legal implications of changes in the law, but few analyze whether the law has an impact on the day-to-day activities of inventors. Alternatively, a tremendous amount of work has been done on best practices in new product planning and development, but little of it recognizes the specific legal environment under which innovation is conducted. Background: priority claim basis has been considered at some length in the legal literature. The United States is currently almost unique in the world in holding on to an FTI system. The FTI system promises patent rights to the first party to conceive of the invention, regardless of who first files the application. The arguments among legal scholars over the two systems have developed to the point where they are so familiar they are referred to in shorthand. Priority claim basis. Essentially, patents are a deal between an inventor and the government, which represents society and industry at large. The inventor is granted exclusive rights to the manufacture, use, sale, and importation of the invention. Patent systems differ in terms of both statute and practice. One major difference is in priority claim, which determines entitlement to patent protection in disputed cases. The manner in which the FTF system, as practiced in Europe and Japan, diverges from the FTI system, as practiced in the United States, is often seen as providing protection for the first to file an application versus protection for the first to conceive of the invention. This division into two categories, however, is overly simplistic. For example, both Japan and Germany have FTF systems, but the practice of each country is noticeably different. Implications for policy. Empirical research in economics, marketing, and management does provide support for the impact of an NIS in general, as well as the impact of a priority claim basis in particular. In this, the focus will be on two key themes found in the literature: pioneering versus incremental innovation. The discussion of the distinction between pioneering and incremental innovation has been with us for quite some time. But in recent years, increasing attention is being given to this topic. Speed to market. In some fields, the technology moves so quickly as to render immaterial legal protection of the underlying intellectual property of innovations. Indeed, a substantial amount of work has been done on how to speed up the innovation process in order to be the first to market with a product. Implications for policy. The implications for policy are clear. Not all types of innovation are the same. Depending on the industry, standing in that industry, risk-taking orientation, and numerous other matters, different entities pursue different types of innovations along a continuum ranging from pioneering to incremental innovations. Currently, these entities have choices in terms of how to protect these activities, including patents, trade secrets, speed to marketing, and rapidly building scale. Further, studies have been carried out on incentive activities relative to U.S. patent law, including exploratory qualitative research, a pilot quantitative study, and a recently completed full-scale quantitative study. The data are still preliminary and subject to further study, but several items are of interest to this analysis. First, throughout this research program, respondents have indicated that the process of moving from conception to reduction to practice to a decision to file a patent to actual filing is quite time-consuming. The average from all the studies appears to be around 2 years, though highly variable. This finding matches up with Griffin's estimates. Thus, under the U.S. system, inventors on average spend about 2 years under the cover of patent protection, while moving from conception to filing. This time may be substantially longer for pioneering innovations and shorter for incremental ones. The quantitative work suggests that inventors recognize the value of all these activities, rating them very highly on a 5-point Likert scale. Of particular interest is the fact that the ratings for the last stage, patent prosecution, were unambiguously highest. The process of writing up the application, structuring the claims, etc., was seen as absolutely critical to gaining a strong patent and appropriate protection for the underlying invention. The users of the system do seem to adapt their activities to the nature of the legal requirements and value the protections of the resulting patent. The ICC, the World Business Organization, was founded in 1919 and represents businesses all over the world. Its mission is to promote cross-border trade and investment and the multilateral trading system. Its membership consists of companies, chambers of commerce, and business organizations of all sizes and from all sectors from 130 countries. The ICC has 3 main activities: rules setting, arbitration, and policy. The ICC also develops self-regulatory business codes, guidelines, and model commercial contracts to spread best practice in various areas. These include advertising and marketing, anti-corruption and bribery, environmental management, corporate social responsibility, customs, and foreign direct investment. The ICC arbitration is one of the preferred methods of resolving conflicts between commercial partners. The ICC, International Court of Arbitration, was created in 1923 and is the most experienced institution for the resolution of global business disputes. Under ICC procedures, proceedings can take place in any country and any language according to any law and with arbitrators of any nationality. The ICC Institute of World Business Law holds colloquial and trains jurists from all over the world on the latest issues in world business law, with a focus on arbitration. IP is an important part of ICC's policy work. Its Commission on Intellectual Property has developed business views on key IP policy issues since the 1920s. More recently, in recognition of the growing phenomenon of counterfeiting and piracy, it founded the BASCAP initiative, which provides a platform for businesses in all sectors to come together to work with governments to fight counterfeiting and piracy. There are several factors determining the types of IP services offered by chambers. The interests of the funding partner. For example, IP offices will tend to promote use of IP registration system. The local economic activity. Chambers will focus on IPRs most appropriate to local businesses. To support chambers of commerce in this area, ICC decided to develop a project which aims to encourage and help chambers set up IP programs for local businesses, brings together existing resources and materials in one place for chambers, and provides an international platform for chambers interested in IP. This aims to provide tools for chambers, not for businesses, and is accessible through a web portal on the ICC website. The website contains several elements: an explanation of what IP is, reasons why IP is important for business and for chambers, IP action in chambers, a summary of IP programs in chambers resulting from a worldwide survey, some outreach tools, information on training programs and tools. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. Bilateral trade agreements, as the name suggests, is an agreement between two nations, while a multilateral trade agreement involves more than two nations. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, was originally created by the Bretton Woods Conference as part of a larger plan for economic recovery after World War II. The GATT's main purpose was to reduce barriers to global trade. The role of GATT in integrating developing countries into an open multilateral trading system is also of major consequence. The WTO's procedure for resolving trade quarrels under the Dispute Settlement Understanding is vital for enforcing the rules and therefore for ensuring the trade flows smoothly. Finally, the consultation period can last up to 60 days. If the consultations fail to resolve the problem, the complaining party can then request that the DSB establish a panel of experts to adjudicate the merits of the case.